So, hello everybody. I think we should start. Welcome to all of you to this conversation seminar with Professor Wolfgang Streeck. My name is Stein Sundstøl Eriksen. I'm a senior researcher here at NUPI, and I will be leading this conversation. So the plan for this seminar is that we have until 10:30, so 1.5 hours altogether. And the conversation between the two of us will last for roughly 1 hour, and then we have half an hour for questions, comments from the audience. This seminar is a part of a seminar series that NUPI is organizing about the crisis of trust in the international system. And there have been seminars before about the situation in China, in the Middle East, in what else? In the US. And there will be more seminars coming in the following months. So watch out if you're interested. Today's seminar will take a more broad or systemic perspective about the evolution of the current state system and contemporary capitalism. So for that, we are pleased to have Professor Streeck here, who has written extensively about the evolution of the crisis in the contemporary world. Professor Streeck is a sociologist and political economist, former director of the Max Planck Institute in Cologne in Germany, and now still working at the Max Planck Institute. And he, among his recent books on these topics, are especially two that will be the main focus of this discussion. One entitled Buying Time, The Crisis of Democratic Capitalism from 2013. And another one entitled How Will Capitalism End?, which is a collection of essays written during the recent few years. So if, for those of you who haven't read any of his writings, I strongly recommend both these books. And perhaps in particular, if you want a good place to start, an article published first in the New Left Review in 2011, I think, called The Crisis of Democratic Capitalism, which is also reprinted in How Will Capitalism End? And this article gives really the broad overview and of the current situation and of Professor Streeck's perspective and analysis of it. Okay, I think we'll just move straight on to the discussion then. And I would like to start by asking you to describe what you mean when you say that democratic capitalism is in crisis and how that crisis has evolved.
Yeah, this, of course, is a very long historical question, but I try to begin by making it simple. If you look at the economy and the polity in a modern industrial society, then they function according to two different principles. The economy functions according to the principle of $1, one vote, whereas democracy, the polity, there the rule is one person, one vote. Now, dollars are differently distributed between persons, of course. And the result of this is that democracy in a modern society has a sort of egalitarian bias. It is in conflict with the sort of systems of distribution in the market, which again, I say, functions like if you read the Bible frequently, you will remember Matthew 19:25. It could be also different, where it says, "He who has will be given, and he who doesn't have will be taken away, whatever he has. So that's, after all, what Jesus says. And this is basically how capitalism works. Yeah, you can call it cumulative advantage, whereas democracy, with the where the large majority of people who do not own capital exercise political power, they sort of introduce a redistributive bias into the political economy. Now that has been known for a very, very long time. It is at the bottom of the fear of the labor movement in the 19th and 20th century, that capital will gang up against them together with the old nobility, the army, and sort of wipe out democracy in order to get away from this redistributive threat. On the other hand, the elites and the capital-owning classes were always sort of tempted to abolish democracy because they were afraid of the majority intervening into their property rights. Now, this has a very, as I said, a very long sort of checkered history. In the 1930s, with the New Deal in the United States, the so-called neoliberal movement began around people like Hayek, Walter Lippmann. The 1930 is a year when they first met, so to speak, in Chicago. Out of this came the Mont Pelerin Society and a long doctrine according to which one had to accept something like democracy, but the market and the sphere of the economy had to be carefully protected from political intervention. You could live with democracy only as long as you could shield the system of privilege in the economy from intervention. Majorities, in other words, had to be neutralized. You could make decisions on whatever you want by majority vote, but not about property rights. And that, as I said, that has a long story. After the Second World War, we were told in schools that democracy and capitalism were sort of twins. They belonged deeply together. That was never ever the case. But only in these sort of three social democratic decades after 1945, when basically there were capital controls everywhere, when the workers' movement were strong, there were strong trade unions. The capital was sort of discredited because of its cooperation with fascism and so on. The working classes were strong because they came back from the battlefield, and they insisted that from now on citizenship would mean something. Because after all, they had fought for their country, and they wanted their country to do something for them. And after these sort of years, when I began to think about this, I saw this period break in the 1970s, when suddenly these sort of neoliberal theories came back. The economy can function only if it is protected from social democratic, socialist, or whatever intervention. Free markets are the ideal organization, but free markets function according to property rights and complete mobility of capital and so on, neutralizing the intervening capacity of the nation state. And then we began to interpret this new configuration, which we call neoliberalism. What is the role of the state in it? Neoliberalism very often sort of pretends that it basically has no state, but the fact is that you need a very strong state to have a free economy, because that strong state, Carl Schmitt already knew this, has to fend off these sort of proletarians who always want to use the government to take something away from the capital-owning classes, and you had to push them back. In other words, as Andrew Gamble wrote about the Thatcher government, the free economy needs a strong state. Yeah, but the state is not an intervening state; it is a protective state. And in Europe, it had to sort of maintain the appearance of effective democratic participation because people expected this, while at the same time That's typical sort of third way, the social democracy, while at the same time opening up the societies to the pressures of international markets and hoping that market pressures will do the disciplining so that the state doesn't do it. Yeah. So that was a rather long answer, but it's a complex story, so to speak, about these two. To finish this off at this point, my the fascination with this began when I began to look seriously at the European Union and how the European Union functions as a sort of technocratic government that very carefully shields economic policy from democratic sovereignty, because it has sort of 18 states, and these states are sort of neutralized, and you have a court, you have a commission which is not elected, that do all the decisions, and basically you saw in Greece, and you now see in the way in which Germany uses the European Monetary Union to impose its own monetary regime on the rest of Europe, how this insulation of the economy from political majorities, how that can work.
So this system, the neoliberal system that has emerged since the 1970s, it has, at least during the last 10 years, entered into a period of, you could call it crisis or stagnation. What are the sources of that stagnation, and what are its symptoms?
That is the big question. I think we know a little bit about this. The neoliberal hope was to sort of sanitize politics of economics, take it out of the take the economy out of political contestation. Now, if you reorganize the post-war democratic capitalist compromise in a neoliberal direction, you get more and more inequality, according to the St. Matthew principle that I quoted. Inequality between classes and inequality between regions, which is sort of becoming extremely important in the global system. These inequalities, where you still have the capacity for democratic mobilization, become the focus of political discontent and political expression, as long as you have elections. And that's something that Hayek and people, they wanted to change the electoral system so that elections would never be about the economy. Yeah, but we still have that. Now we've seen a long period where the social democratic parties and the center-left parties sort of, for all sorts of reasons, began to side with the internationalist perspective on the economy, thereby neutralizing the power of their own states. Where you have protest, it sort of expresses itself in new movements that have sort of dissociated themselves from traditional social democracy. These can be right wing and left wing. It could be Bernie Sanders. It could be what's the name of this guy? Trump, and it could be Corbyn. It could be AfD. Basically these movements are in a very inarticulate way have something to do with the fear that the internationalized economy will deprive them of their capacity to use political power to protect themselves from sort of the increasingly disruptive effects of restructuring and so on. And my own view of this is that since we, center-left, or in my case, center-left people have failed to provide a language for this sort of process, because we didn't anticipate it in this way. Now all sorts of demagogues are beginning to enter into this field, and that results in political blockades, in sort of all sorts of very strange political conflicts about where basically the conflict is about the functioning of the political economy and the embedding of national and regional economies into the global economy. What we're talking about is immigration. Yeah, it's a very strange sort of movement of the axis of conflict. Yeah. So the historical moment, of course, is 2008. 2008 is a year when, of course, the financial crisis in most countries, average incomes have not yet returned to the level of pre-2008, and that is very important because in a capitalist society is based on growth, not just on growth of capital. Of course, growth of capital is the main game, but you also need some sort of accretion of prosperity for the rest of the population, because otherwise why should they basically work for accumulating more and more capital if all they have is what they always had? Yeah, we have a sort of artificial subsistence economy for 80% of the population, and the rest are sort of becoming richer and richer. And that's something that you cannot do forever. That's my view on that.
In the book Buying Time, you describe the transition from what you call the tax state via the debt state to the consolidation state.
Yeah.
Could you explain a bit about that analysis and those stages in the evolution of?
That's my sort of my historical DNA model. There's another development sort of screwed into this, which is the transition from an inflationary to a public debt economy to a private debt economy. This is closely linked to this. In essence, after the end of post-war growth and the end of capitalists being intimidated by the possibility that there was an alternative system and that you couldn't really trust unions and social democratic parties. For example, take Sweden in the 1970s, when capital was seriously concerned that the workers' funds would sort of absorb, nationalize Swedish capital. Yeah. The 70s are the tipping point, not just in Sweden, everywhere else. In the 70s, we enter into a high inflation period. Why? Because after the profit squeeze of the late 1960s and the worker unrest everywhere, 68, 69, capital was sort of very intimidated. They didn't know what to do. They were looking for a way out. Globalization begins at this time in series, in earnest. And the governments saw that now, for external as well as internal as well as political reasons, capital was no longer willing to make concessions to the working class. The result of this, because they were afraid that this would lead into a different system, the result of this was inflation. Why? High wage settlements that would, under normal conditions, have resulted in unemployment were accommodated by central banks by sort of injecting money into the economy, so that the money illusion on the part of workers and partly on the part of capitalists so they created the impression that there was something like redistribution going on. So in the 1970s, we get inflation rates of up to 20% in the United Kingdom, 18% in America. Only in Germany, for some sort of strange reason, we didn't have that sort of inflation. So inflation was an instrument to manage the tensions between capital and labor in the 1970s. But if inflation continues, then so it uses its usefulness as a political tool, because then the capital owners become extremely nervous. Their stuff is losing value all the time. So in 1980, the American Central Bank ended inflation in the entire Western world by raising American interest rates to 20% for a while, Volcker in 1980, causing deindustrialization, all sorts of problems, huge unemployment everywhere. The result of which was that now another tension arose: the tension about the welfare state and the means of responding to economic crisis. That again was it couldn't be settled by inflation, but it was settled by the debt state, by sort of public debt. As inflation goes down, public debt goes up. That's the sort of the 1970s, 1980s. It is another instrument of managing tensions, basically functionally equivalent, not the same, but it has the same property that after a while it loses its usefulness. So by the mid-1990s at the latest, public debt became a nuisance for capital, in the sense of capital being the creditors. Creditors want to know that the debtors can pay the stuff back. So in the 1990s, everybody was concerned that now states everywhere in the West were so indebted that they would not be able, they might go declare bankruptcy. So states can declare bankruptcy and then they apply a haircut, basta, that's all. You can't take a state to court. So, so what happens? In the mid-1990s begins a great consolidation wave. That consolidation, however, resulted in a withdrawal of purchasing power from these political economies that had to be compensated for by a third trick. The third trick was private debt. So then you open, you deregulate the credit markets that had already been deregulated for the state to indebt itself, now for the private sector. And household debt goes up as public debt goes down. I discovered this when I initially, very early after 2008, I had to give a lecture at the University of Bielefeld on the crisis, and that was a time when these people didn't have good technology, so I couldn't use PowerPoint. What I had to use were these sort of foils that you can put, and I had my foils sort of on top of each other, and I looked at them and I saw, right, how inflation goes down, public debt goes up, and how public debt goes down, private debt goes up. And I thought, my God, yeah, this, and I remembered John Goldthorpe's analysis of inflation in the 1970s. Inflation is an expression of lack of trust, political tensions, an attempt to moderate political tension. Then the debt state, exactly the same analysis from the anti-Keynesian public choice people. And then my friend Colin Crouch in the 1990s invents this notion of privatized Keynesianism. Keynesianism being at its end because you had to repay the debt, but then you privatize it. You give the cash to individuals. And this thing, this is intertwined with sort of what I call the crisis sequence: inflation, public debt, private debt, intertwined with the tax state, as Schumpeter called it, to the debt state, which was possible only, which responded to the fiscal crisis of the state that was, we talked about yesterday, that was already described by the late 1970s by someone like O'Connor, who, however, never anticipated that states could solve that problem by indebting themselves. Because at the time, the credit system didn't just... And so you can say, essentially, in the 1980s, the American government allowed the banking system, by deregulating it, to engage in all sorts of very critical things, and benefited from this by borrowing itself. Yeah, and that process of financial deregulation continued in the 1990s, when you had to allow everyone to use increased house prices to use their house as a cash machine. yeah, by borrowing on the rising house prices. All of this came to a crunch in 2008. And my short answer to the long question is this: after 2008, we're in the interregnum. We don't know. We just don't know what to do. Replacing the debt state with a consolidation state results in public uprising, yeah, from Greece to the United States to whoever. The new trick is sort of producing money out of thin air through quantitative easing. Maybe this is the fourth fix to the problem, but to that fix the same applies as to the others. In the other case, it was always roughly 10 years that it worked. So now we're in 2018, and we had quantitative easing for 8 years or so. So in 2 years, take care. You don't know what's going to happen.
So would it be correct, in your opinion, to say that the root problem which set off this development was declining growth rates and falling rates of profit from the late 1960s onwards, and that these have not since been recovered?
That is I agree with the first part of the statement, in the sense that two factors sort of play together. One is the increasing confidence of the working class. That cannot be underestimated. In the early 1970s, those people who led workers on the shop floor in the trade unions had didn't have the personal experience of unemployment, economic crisis, and so on. They were extremely confident. That confidence was perceived as a threat on the part of capital, and you see this. They write about it. It is called ungovernability in the language of the upper classes. Ungovernability, a revolution of rising expectations. Yeah, that's the literature in the early 1970s, in economics departments, everywhere in the establishment. My God, these people have expectations. They even have the expectation that their lives will be better and better and better and better. That's shameless. Yeah, we're not going to pay for this, and then of course there's another group of claimants, which Stein basically relates also to your work, which is the third world. In other words, the capitalist growth machine depended on cheap raw materials that you had to buy from the periphery. And in the early 1970s, the oil-producing countries sort of wanted their share, in the same way as the working classes. And so you had two different claims on capital coming together at the same time. And you had decolonialization, where the big danger was that more countries than the Arab countries, the oil-producing countries, would get together and demand their share in the prosperity of capitalist countries. So then you had to invent a new economic world order. In the 1970s and 1980s, these new countries came together, formed an association of 77 member states of the United Nations called the New Economic Order such and such, new economic world order, yeah, and they made sort of brazen demands like recompensation for the costs of colonialism. Yeah, managed global markets for raw materials. So all of this was quite threatening, and in this period you had to invent new ways, and that was But what was your question, Steve?
Well, what was it?
What?
the root
cause,
cause of
yeah,
falling profitability.
yeah. That was the profit crunch, the profit squeeze,
Yeah.
and then the second question was, we still have that profit. That depends that depends on which sectors of the economy you're talking about. Together with the deindustrialization of the 1980s, you have new forms of property, of prosperity arising. For example, financial sector. Yeah, I think I can reconstruct these numbers. In 1990, 14% of the profits in the American economy came from the financial sector. In 2008, before the crisis, it had risen to 40%. Yeah, and if there's any sector that is highly profitable or used to be, that's finance. In finance, you can make much more money than in industry. In industry, you have to compete. Finance, nobody understands what you're doing anyway, and you can go to the central bank and always refinance yourself. It is not an accident that all the sort of capitalist centers in the history of the West very early turned into financial centers. They financialized themselves. Look at northern Italy, Genova in particular, which could be called the first capitalist center. Yeah. Also Florence. The Medici used to produce textiles. In the next generation, they produced money. Then you go from there to Genova and to Amsterdam. Amsterdam is the same thing. Amsterdam was the center of a global empire, which was basically based initially on textiles. And then suddenly they invented the central bank, they invented banking, they invented all sorts of tricks. So Amsterdam became the next one. London the same. It moves from Amsterdam to London. After the war, the British sort of defeated the Dutch, and the British took over. And the British were the first manufacturing country, right, in the 19th century, Marx. But it didn't take long for them to become the country of the city, of money, because money is much more profitable than textiles. And then you move to the United States in the first part of the 20th century, which is now the center, and you see the same thing, deindustrializing and Wall Street taking over. So what you see is a shift in the profitability of different sectors, and as finance takes over, you can accumulate unbelievable fortunes simply by printing paper with sort of certificates on them. Yeah.
But still, overall growth rates have not really...
No, growth rates not. But one has to, that's important. That's something that we can easily train ourselves. We have been told in school or in universities that capitalism is about growth. It is not about growth. It is about profitability. That's something else. And for capitalism, growth and full employment and all of these things are sort of things that might ensue as a result of profit making. They just as well might not, if you can make your profits without them. And that's what you do today, because the financial profits have nothing to do with full employment. Yeah, they can be made without full employment for a while, because then the problem arises of the sort of very asymmetrical distribution that comes from finance, and the question becomes what to do with all this capital, because there's no demand anymore for things, because you sit on piles of capital, and you can't invest it because there's nobody who has money to buy whatever you invest in. So that's the old Keynesian problem. You need some sort of purchasing power in order to invest. So what do? Basically, they keep the money in the financial system, and they sort of sell the money from one to the other and deduct fees, and the fees make them very rich. And if they need more money, they go to the central bank and sell to the central bank the papers that they have sold to each other, and the central bank gives them cash for it. So that's a self-sustaining circle. How long? I don't know. I don't think you can do this forever.
Following up on finance, this touches upon the question of globalization.
Yeah.
And one key implication of the globalization, especially perhaps the globalization of finance and the deregulation of capital movements, has been that the scope of action for states becomes severely constrained by structural factors which states themselves cannot really do much about. Is that, would you agree with that?
Absolutely. And in fact, I've been reading a new book by a guy named Quinn Slobodian, whom I'm supposed to review for a journal. I think that's the best, absolutely the best source on exactly that point, because what he describes is the invisible power of the mobility of capital as a disciplining force on nation states. Yeah, you can live with nation states. So he describes in the, in the book Buying Time, I discover this guy Friedrich Hayek, Friedrich August von Hayek, as the main architect of the neoliberal world. Slobodian, much more. He's a historian of ideas. He's much more precise than I was in this book. He really shows that I was right, but without knowing why I was so right. And now I read this book and I think, my God, yeah, that you should all have known. And Hayek essentially after the war, faced with the rise in the number of nation states, from 60 at the beginning of the United Nations to 150 in the 1970s. Now it's 200. Yeah, faced with this, he complains about the end of empire, because empires had been able to create large markets. What to do if you had to accept that there could be no empires? And then he uses the term of dominion as the replacement of empire. And dominion is the right to property enforced on an international scale, so that these states will not have they may be sovereign, but under the new world economic order, they should not have the right to expropriate property. The right to property should be above the level of, above the sovereignty of states, which means an enormous sort of curtailment of democratic politics. And if you think about it, it also means privatization, because why should the state have property if the right of private property precedes everything? And that is sort of, dominion means property, and property rights means, by implication, the right to move wherever you want. Yeah? That goes back even to Adam Smith, where Adam Smith in The Wealth of Nations has this really impressive. This guy. I mean, I can only recommend that you read the first 6, 7, 8 chapters of The Wealth of Nations once again, because everybody claims they have read it. Very few people actually have. Where he says, the owner of the proprietor of stock is a true citizen of the world, because he can move his stock from one country to from a country where he is subjected to such as taxation. He can move that stock from that country to another, where he can continue his activities as he pleases or enjoy the benefits of his wealth. Yeah. So so once you have established that right, and you can prevent states from doing this, and now look at post-war history, what happens to countries that try to expropriate American companies. Yeah. The United States have tools to teach them that they better not do it. Yes, to maintain dominion above sovereignty as a replacement for empire. And that you find in the 1945, even 1943 beginning literature by Hayek and a lot of sort of German economists like Röpke and so on. The whole Mont Pelerin society sort of is organized around this particular problem. Well into the 1980s or 1970s, when Hayek gets the Economics Nobel Prize for exactly this. Yeah, the principle of free markets enforced by international law. And if international law doesn't do it, then you have some military units to help out. Yes, that sort of is the way you can live with the multiplication of national sovereignty, but only that way. If countries begin to neglect dominion, you have war.
So in connection with the neoliberal system, Margaret Thatcher famously said that there is no alternative.
Yeah.
So the so-called TNOW doctrine.
Yes.
Now, if what you say about the international imposition of liberal or neoliberal economic policies and the implications of globalized finance, if these things are true, then maybe Margaret Thatcher's claim was right. Not in the sense that people normally criticize her. I mean, of course, it's not... Social conditions can always be different. You cannot see globalization as a force of nature. But given the structural properties of the current system with globalized finance and partly politically imposed property rights on a global level, within that system, the TNOW doctrine has some truth to it.
Yes and no. I agree with you in the following sense, that if you want to reconstruct a social economy that is not just a capitalist economy, you have to take up the issue of globalization. There's no way around it. The sort of third world third way complacency, we have a global economy and we have to adjust to it, that plays directly into the hand of neoliberalism. You will never get out of the trap. Now, interestingly, under the impression of Trumpism and Corbynism and Brexit and so on, now we're beginning to see that even economists at leading economics departments are now beginning to think about what they call responsible protectionism. Larry Summers, responsible nationalism. Larry Summers, the chief architect of financial deregulation under Clinton. A deregulated economic world, Summers writes in the Financial Times, and where else would he write? In the Financial Times, cannot be politically sustained. Therefore, we need to think about a new role for the nation state. And the nation state as an arena of the exercise also of economic sovereignty. Responsible nationalism, yes, of course, be bound into an order of as much as possible international peace, but also with the right to, for example, take Danny Roderick. Roderick, also at Harvard, he has written for years about the question. One of his books is called "Has Globalization Gone Too Far?" And the basic idea is extremely simple, but all good ideas are extremely simple. He says yes, economists tell us free trade is good for everyone, for all parties, And already Ricardo has shown this. But he says we live in a finite world, and there's time involved. Maybe initially it's only good for some, and others suffer. Yeah, and the healing of the suffering may take a lot of decades, so that an entire generation or two are wasted as a result of free trade until the equilibrium has been restored. And no responsible democratic politician can tolerate this. Can you sacrifice a generation for the benefit of the next generation? That's an ethical question. It's a political question, and so on. So managed trade. Now they're increasingly talking about a free trade world with exceptions, unlike under the regime of the World Trade Organization, that individual countries can claim protection for individual sectors and so on. The same applies to financial globalization. Financial globalization is not something that has happened like nature. It was imposed by the World Bank and the International Monetary Fund on countries that were applying for assistance, and they were told, yes, you can have some assistance, but you have to admit American credit cards. Yes. I think that's the fundamental problem. In recent work, I've become interested in what I call political scale. That is, how big should and might a sovereign political unit be? It's interesting to see that most states are very small. So Norway has, I think, 5 million inhabitants. That's much closer to the average, which is like 7 million, than, for example, Germany. Germany is very big. By as Guy de Maupassant, Frenchman, used to say, I love Germany so much that I would like to have more of them by cutting it in pieces. Yes, maybe that would be good for the rest of the world. In any case, what are the advantages of small size in a world in which you want to manage your economies and not just sort of let the world market determine your fate? If I may use 2 more minutes to say that, in an interesting way, small size means less heterogeneity, more homogeneity, also in terms of industrial structures. So you marry a territory with 1 or 2 sectors. In Denmark, you don't build cars, but what you do is you have a strong sector of business consulting or logistics. Yeah, but with Danish logistics and the consulting and design, Denmark is already busy. They don't have more sectors. As a result of this, you can use your the political tools of a nation state to promote these sectors so that they can find a niche in the global economy where they can, by and large, survive. Because then you use the educational system, you use the infrastructure, the public infrastructure, and so on, to promote these sectors and make them sort of, let's call industrial policy. Industrial policy is much easier in a small state than it is in a big state, because in a big state, you don't know what sector to attend to, and you would have to make decisions. Like in Germany, we are for automobiles and against mining, but of course the brown coal or the soft coal miners are not eager to support such a policy. Yeah, so small size, homogeneity, the capacity to specialize on particular sectors and niche seeking in the global economy can be a possible way of using sort of national sovereignty as a tool to improve. And also in a small country, you have less regional conflicts. Yeah, oh, I know. Yeah, before I came here, I read a little bit about Norway, and it is true that this doesn't apply always. But then, it is interesting to see, for example, that a small country like Switzerland is extremely decentralized because they have four different ethnicities, and they have developed a formula how you can be a nation state without a state nation. Yeah, and the trick is federalism. So federalism sort of lowers the level of sovereignty and authority even one step further. So that one part of the country can specialize on X and the other can specialize on Y. But sectoral specialization assisted by public policy in smaller units may actually be a formula how you sort of get to a managed economy that is not Hayekian.
Maybe this relates back to something that you've written about earlier, about varieties of capitalism. In your recent work, though, you have been more concerned about what you've called the commonalities of capitalism. Yeah. So the question then becomes, how much scope is there for a variety of capitalisms along the lines that you just suggested, given the pressures towards convergence, especially associated with globalization?
If I, when I shifted the perspective from varieties to commonalities, that basically reflected my experience, similar to the experience that I described at this Bielefeld conference. You suddenly see something that you didn't see before. And these curves were averages for the 20 or 25 capitalist countries, not just one country. And the variation around these averages was surprisingly low. Yeah. So in the 70s, everybody had inflation. In the 1980s, everybody began. Now you can say where they had oil, they didn't have public debt. Forget it. But the rest of the world functioned exactly like that. Yeah, and so in that sense, looking at the historical trajectory out of the post-war settlement, where the post-war settlement was interestingly similar in all the Western countries. And I describe this as the post-war standard model of democracy. It is sort of basically similar. Even the party structures are similar. Center right, center left, a small nationalist left over, a small communist left over from the 1920s, and in the middle you had basically center left, center right. You had strong trade unions. You had collective bargaining governing the entire economy. In my view of the world, trade unions and collective bargaining are part of the model of democracy. It is only in recent years that people don't say that anymore because basically trade unions have disappeared in most countries. So you have an independent judiciary, you have a press which basically is free. If in Germany you advocated for communism, of course you went into prison in the 1950s, but apart from that, it was a free press. So you can this model was pretty much universal. Yeah. Then what we talked about in terms of varieties were different logics, how this model played itself out in economic terms. So, for example, up to the present day, Germany is an over-industrialized country that depends on a stable currency and on export surpluses. Whereas France is a country that is politically highly centralized, requires a deficit in the state budget, which is then afterwards sort of caught up with by the grand projet that they have sort of very good industries, but they all work on sort of state pressure, and the government first has to take the lead. Yeah, therefore you need more you need more leeway for budgetary policy. Italy is a country that is driven by domestic consumer demand, always was, as a result of which you need a relatively high level of inflation. That can be rectified in a normal world by devaluing the currency once in a while, and then you can continue to flourish. Yeah. Now the Germans have imposed their model on the rest of Europe, as a result of which the French suffer because they can't have budget deficits anymore. The Italians suffer because they can't have inflation anymore, and the Germans are the sort of are the prosperity zone of the eurozone. And everybody, all the capital goes to Germany, all the investment goes to Germany, and the others wonder why it doesn't happen there. That's where we talk about varieties of capitalism, different sort of economic styles, different ways in which this complicated compromise between privatized capital accumulation without end and the ways people live. Yes, the Lebenswelt, so to speak, the complicated compromise between the two takes different forms in different countries, and of course Latin countries function differently than northern countries, as we all know, and the United States function differently from Brazil. I don't describe this in terms of value judgments. I describe this in terms of different solutions to the fundamental paradox of capitalism, which is that people tend to be essentially satisfied with the way they live, whereas capital doesn't allow them to do this because it requires ever more continuing Protestant ethic, like continuing effort so that capital can grow. You have to re-educate people to become sort of endlessly busy, endlessly busy, even if it doesn't make any sense anymore. They basically have everything that they need. If you compare let's say a year like 1970 to today, 50 years ago or whatever it was, yeah, folks, 1970 everybody was well off. Now we are working harder. Masses of people have gone into the labor market that were not in the labor market in 1970. Work has intensified, and why? Yeah, it's a very good question. From the perspective of capital accumulation, it's not a question. That's necessary. People have to be educated in exactly that way. From the perspective of the Lebenswelt of people, that is not necessarily plausible. Yeah, and so in different countries you get different compromises between what I call the subsistence mentality that easily spreads among people, and the necessity for capital to grow. The Latins have different ways of coping with it. The Germans internalize the growth the growth principle, and then they work, and others handle it differently. Yeah, but that's what when I talk about the varieties of capitalism, and it has important impacts still to the present day, because institutions and if you want cultures are very difficult to change, because if you begin with one, take Italy, Renzi. Nobody remembers Renzi anymore, although he was prime minister until a year ago. Why? Because Renzi thought that all these smart people at OECD were telling him he had to reform the job market, the labor law, with his jobs legislation, and then everything would work. And he did it, and nothing happened. Why? Because there's a deeply rooted expectation in Italy that once you have a job, you keep that job. So even employers don't want to fire people. Yeah. Then you have a social structure which is very much based on family, like in the United States, where people can move anywhere, any place, anytime if they get a job. In Italy, it's completely impossible. All my sociologist friends live in Milan. They have chairs in Sicily, in Bari, and wherever. They fly there. Yeah, but the family is in Milan, and so different structures, different institutions, these interlock, and they are very difficult to break up from the outside.
Following up on this tension that you
Yeah.
describe between the dynamics of capitalism or the market on the one hand and the culture or life world on the other. Now, one could say that as the capitalist dynamic leads to an expansion of market relations to ever greater parts of society, there is a risk that it could undermine the preconditions on which market relations themselves depend.
Yeah.
And in that case, these cultural factors would be under ever more pressure as market relations expand.
That is the old question. You can have a positive and a negative sort of expectation based on it. The positive expectation, quote unquote, is that markets undermine themselves by undermining trust, confidence, and so on, so that capitalism destroys its own preconditions. And then we get at a point. That's an old socialist, also Catholic, incidentally, topic. At some point, capitalism sort of has eaten up social resources that cannot be replaced in a competitive, money-driven society. Yeah,
like trust.
Like trust, absolutely, yes. Then that's a sort of positive thing. At some stage, we'll be fed up with capitalism, and replace it with something else, and have to, because otherwise the thing doesn't work. I share this to an extent, but I differentiate between different types of societies. The Chinese, if the Chinese dream / nightmare of the social credit system, that is the individualized surveillance of each single citizen, if that materializes, then you can sort of restore trust in a sort of mechanical, electronicized way. You meet someone, and your device shows you that he has a sort of a social credit score of 98, and so you can deal with him. Yeah. Whereas if he has a social credit score of 55, you will be careful, and if it's only 20, you slap him in the face and tell him to disappear. Yeah, and it is obvious that modern means of social control can, to an extent, serve as a functional equivalent for social trust. Now, then we get into an Orwell-like world where Orwell assumed that there is a sort of residual humanity that will rebel against this at some point. And you can have that confidence. I have it, but it may take time until we get there. The less optimistic perspective on this is that what Marx called the total subsumption under capital. And if you look at the way in which consumer societies, consumerism and consumer capitalism function, then you sometimes see it approaching something like this, that people get sort of fanaticized about the new T-shirt, the new band that you have to listen to, and you forget them after half a year, and this sort of permanent turnover of fashion, and the absolute determination on the part of so many people not to fall back in this circle. I make a sort of personal experiment, ein Selbstversuch, as they say in the medical sciences. I'm on Twitter, and I follow the Kardashians. I don't know if you know who the Kardashians are. Every day they tell you which pizza they had last night and to what party they went, and and what sort of product you have to buy in order to keep up with the Kardashians. And they have I don't know 60 million followers. And the youngest Kardashian, which is now 18, is already a billionaire for all the products that she sells, simply by sending you Twitter messages. Yeah. They all look fabulous.
I guess it's a depressing thought that these things can serve as a stabilizing
Yes,
social
that
force.
is the depressing
But
thought.
but that, at the same time as you have this tendency,
Yeah.
you have the growing revolts.
Yes.
And those could be seen as an indication of
Yeah.
a
Conflict.
protest against
Yeah.
well, you could call it the neoliberal regime.
Yes.
Which brings me, before we close, to the question of contemporary populism and its emergence, and how one should interpret it.
Yeah. I'm skeptical about the concept because it's essentially a sort of propagandistic concept used by established parties against everyone who doesn't fit into their framework. Yeah. So Bernie Sanders is a populist, Corbyn is a populist, Trump is a populist. In Germany, in the last before the last election, the Social Democrats were, of course, as they always are, part of the Merkel government, and at some stage, one of their ministers said something like, if we have unlimited immigration, we should at least have unlimited attention to the needs of people who are unemployed or whatever, and we should do something for them as well. Next day, Merkel told him to shut up because this was populist. Yeah. So populist is whatever you choose to, whatever you don't like, you will basically call it like that. But of course, the glamour world of consumerism doesn't include everyone. It excludes people. If you look at the Kardashians, most women don't look like the Kardashians, if I may say so. So they feel deprived if they look at them. May feel deprived. Yeah. And most people can't buy the stuff, although that stuff is getting cheaper and cheaper, and you can take up consumer credit. There's limits to what you can buy, and so then people begin to feel excluded from it. There's other forms of exclusion, like we cosmopolitans tend to talk contemptuously about people who just want to sit in their gardens and don't want to be disturbed by immigration and all of this, and we call them populists or whatever, and they get angry at us. Yeah, they get angry. So they say, it's a democracy here. We want to be respected. So in this world, respect plays an important part. It becomes a cultural conflict if it is a conflict about participation in the consumer world. In any case, yeah, yes, and I think that. See, in this introduction to how will capitalism end, I describe a life world that would be the life world that would be required by the continuation of capitalism in this period of interregnum. And I organize this around 4 topics, 4 sort of attitudes that people or behavioral patterns that people have to adopt in order to stabilize a systemically unstable system. And I call this coping, everyday coping. Yeah, if you look at young families with 2 children and 2 jobs, it's unbelievable what these people do in terms of planning and so on. So coping, hoping. Hoping is extremely important. It becomes an obligation, a duty of citizens to be hopeful. If you're not, there's something wrong with you. Coping, hoping, doping. Yeah, you see doping from if you only look enough. it comes from music, from everything else. People in the morning go to work. Everybody listens to his own music, and they are sort of being pumped with rhythms right in the morning so that they can function. Yeah, it's historically a completely different use of music from what it used to be before, where it was a communal event. You were listening to someone who was playing there, and everybody else was sitting around. Now it's sort of consumerist, individualistic, and it has doping functions. Yeah, in this chapter, I'm incidentally saying there are two kinds of doping. One is doping for success, and one is doping as a substitute for success. Those that dope as a substitute for success go to prison because they are the normal street doping guys. Those who dope for success become professors or actors, and if you would apply the same principles to them, most music performances and movies will have to be shot behind bars. Because that's where the actors would be. Yes. So we have coping, hoping, doping, and the fourth is shopping. Shopping as the sort of activity around which social life becomes organized. Look at a family over the weekend when they go to a shopping center. They don't know what they are going to buy, but they have a communal experience. The children, the parents, they have no communal experiences anymore during the week. But when they go shopping, it's like a little roaming family band in the Stone Age, which sort of goes and looks around what animals there are that they can eat. Yes. So, and in the end of this chapter, I'm saying that I cannot imagine that you can breed a generation of people who would be satisfied with those four activities. Maybe for a while, but not forever. And that's the sort of even the small ray of hope in this pessimistic scenario.
Okay, thank you. I think we'll stop with the conversation here to have some time for questions and comments from the audience. So please state your names and be brief in your questions so that more than a few people can have a chance. Yeah, first here.
Can you say something about moving the industry to China and the China's possibility to get resources from Siberia? They have maybe 1 billion very poor people, and if China starts to use themselves, and we shall start to make cars or clothes and so, we need maybe 10 times more labor to produce something compared to China, and what the consequence. And this globalization to move factory, for example, something from Gjøvik, a small city in Norway, or larger city, everybody live on that. It's built up a lot of apartments, houses, hospitals, schools, a lot of things, and you move this abroad. What shall the people there do? Shall they move after?
Please finish, so we have more people.
Short. If a capital owner owns 1 billion, he can have 10,000 people working for himself. What is democracy in this? Also, he owns 1 billion. He has the power of 10,000 people for 1 year. That is not democracy.
People of my age have a bad short-time memory. So I begin with your last question, and then I hope to work forward to your first question. But I may already have forgotten it. No, I think part of what I think could be a possible, as Stein asked, a possible alternative where there is supposed to be no alternative, would be communal properties. property, that is infrastructures, that is public institutions, public schools, cooperatives, which aren't easy to move from one place to another. Where you rediscover the idea of property that is owned by a community rather than by an individual, you can bind it, you can tie it to a particular place, and then you can use that infrastructure to attract investment, people, and so on, to convince them to stay where they are. That's at least a hope. As far as China is concerned, then that, of course, is the big mystery of the present time. I cannot claim to know much about this country, although one should know much more about it. But what I think is the case is that that country itself is a place with enormous internal tensions that has something to do with disparities between regions and with the distribution of the population in these regions. In one of my recent papers, I suggest that the trend towards authoritarian government in large states has something to do with the fact that central governments have lost the capacity to redistribute between regions. If you look at China, that could be very much the case. And the fact that the now Chinese president is beginning to turn out like a sort of authoritarian dictator may have to do with the fact that this country is extremely difficult to hold together. And now the question is, will it blow up? Will it be federalized and so on? How will it get along with the United States? Russia is a very important part of this. I don't want to go into these details. I only will say that this is something where an institute like this one should invest a lot of resources to get more better knowledge about it.
Thank you so much for a very interesting conversation. I was wondering if you could elaborate upon the core story that you're telling, or argument about the structural pressure to facilitate increased profits, and then try to say something about what are the implications of that for international politics. So you've talked about the capitalist system, etc. Does this mean, according to the explanation that you have provided, that the behavior in the relationship between states will change? So we know that there are a lot of other stuff going on, international security concerns, etc. But if you just extrapolate from your core argument, what does the world then look like?
Yeah. I'm bad at making predictions, but I want to say something on the historical precedents of the present situation. In the history of capitalism, as the world system theory has argued, you always need one capitalist center. The center has to have military power to secure the periphery and the cheap materials and the new markets and so on. And it has to be a center with one money in which everybody can trust, because capitalism is based on credit. Therefore, it has to grow, because if credit is not repaid, then the whole social structure will fragment. Yeah? It needs to grow, and in order to grow, it needs an army, and it needs a virgin territory that it can conquer, and so on. And then, historically, the sort of the role of the center of capitalism shifts. I mentioned that in my previous remarks. You can say, in a simplified way, from northern Italy or Genova to the Netherlands, to the United Kingdom, to the United States. There's one period, the period between the First World War and the end of the Second World War, in which this was sort of not clear where the center was. The United States were unwilling to play the role. The British were no longer able to play the role. you could argue that the British and the United States were using this situation as hegemons for their own benefit rather than providing the services of hegemony to the rest of the world. What happened? In two parts of the world, secessionist tendencies began, and the idea was built around empire, Japan, Germany, and about autarkic empires that would be insulated from whoever the global capitalist hegemon would be by external borders for which they, however, needed to conquer the surrounding societies. Yeah, two expansionist, autarkistic, you can say secessionists from the global order. They were defeated after 1945. America essentially took on the role of hegemon, and there was also the USSR, but that didn't matter in this game because it was not capitalist. Now we have a situation of a declining hegemon, the United States, that keeps losing its wars since Vietnam. They didn't win a single war. And the Chinese sort of beginning to rise on the horizon with the question of a double authority, a twofold authority in the global capitalist economy. Look at China as it builds its new Silk Road from east to west, well into the Mediterranean, where the United States think they own the Mediterranean, the Seventh Fleet. Yes, and now suddenly the Chinese begin to appear and buy the harbor of Athens. Now, or build railways on the Balkans, like the Germans built a railway before the First World War, the Baghdad railway, resulting in all sorts of complications, put it mildly, after 1914. Yes, so now the question is it possible to conceive of a double shared authority in a global political economy with two monies, maybe, two armies that divide the world, and the neutralization of the rest of the world, like Europe, Russia in particular? I can't answer that question. But if I was into international political economy, I would think that is the question. Is it possible, for the first time in the history of capitalism, to have a divided authority in the global capitalist system? Because the Chinese will certainly not. Perry Anderson has written a fantastic book on the concept of hegemony, which I had the pleasure to review in the London Review of Books. And there he has a chapter on China, which let's say is 10 or 15 years ago old, where China is described as a place where people are so confident that they are the center of the world that they don't have to conquer anything. They just sit where they are. Yeah? Now, it seems to be different. And to me, it has something to do with the fact that now China is thoroughly capitalist. And as a capitalist society, it has to be expansive. It just can't. It has to go into Africa. It has to go into the Mediterranean. It has to sort of go on the southern border of Russia and maybe slice up Russia in order to be able to get into Siberia because they need raw materials. And so on and so on and so on. That is, to me, sort of the question. Is it possible to think of China as an expansive, expansionary power driven by the capitalist need to accumulate? Mind you that the Chinese economy is more in debt than the American economy. And if you have debt, you have to grow. There's no way. You cannot not grow if you're in debt.
Thank you very much for the talk, Professor. My name is Lucas Haugeberg. And I have a question in relation to what you're saying about financial markets and what that means for Norway, particularly. Because you could argue that Norway is actually the most capitalist state, at least in the world, given that like the sovereign wealth fund owns between 1 and 2% of all the world's stocks, and that each Norwegian has about 200,000 US dollars in money invested in the international financial market through that. So given that background, what does that mean for Norway, and how should Norwegian foreign policy relate to that? Are we too invested in the global financial system that we have an incentive as well in kind of maintaining it?
I asked him this last night, and he couldn't give me an answer. So, yeah. I want to make one distinction, though. This is communal property, and by sort of simply dividing the amount of money in it, that doesn't make the individual Norwegian an owner of $200,000. That's important to me. Yeah, it's a sort of communal enterprise, which can be held publicly responsible. You can ask accountable. You can ask, what are they doing with the money? Where are they investing it? And there's a sort of there could be a democratic sensitivity about what you do with this money. Is it sort of well invested, also in an ethical sense, or would you, if South Africa was still under apartheid, put it into South Africa if the returns are high? These are questions that are not normally asked about capitalist property, and they cannot be asked in the same responsible way as they can here. In that sense, I wouldn't say that it's a sort of paradox. The state is a capitalist in the sense that it invests money, but the individual is not a capitalist, it's a co-owner in a cooperative, so to speak, and that's something different. That money also cannot go away. You own it as a community, the 5.2 million ones. If it was owned by Bob Gates, right, or someone else, he could immediately remove it and put it into Saudi Arabia or something like that. That difference, I would think, is important. And the questions that you then added to this are questions that you can only ask on the condition that this particular kind of property exists. Yeah, and that is a hopeful perspective, I think. It's not your fault that you have all this oil, but in a sort of civilized world, property, even collective property, comes with responsibility, and responsibility comes with public discourse. You have to reason about it. What do we do? And this is exactly what you're doing.
Thanks for the conversation. My name's Abel. It seems the neoliberals, or the key figures who push neoliberalism, understood the need to integrate philosophy, politics, sociology, economics, and law. What can we learn from that? What can we integrate now to counter this neoliberal regime?
That is the really very good question, and yeah, I think that's the kind of thing that we now call political economy, and as a sort of mainline sociologist trained in the United States in the 1970s, it took some time for me to understand that. But the program that you outline, I think, is the program for responsible social science in the future. Exactly these disciplines, and no longer split up thinking about societies in these sort of very different things. And you're absolutely right. Hayek, for example, he really gets to your nerves if he becomes sort of elitist and anti. Yeah, I would even think anti-normal people. Yeah. On the other hand, if you read his stuff and you see this enormous ambition to bring together historical knowledge, economic theory, even cybernetics, yeah, in a sometimes misplaced and also, I would say, a little bit how do you say, overblown way. Yeah, but at least he tries to do it. Whereas if you look at the normal economics department, they don't even understand his problems. Although what he has, together with his fellows, sort of thought up, has been the recipe for the reorganization of the world after the end of Keynesianism and the New Deal in the 1970s, and they have laid the foundations for it. And if you think about it in terms of a history of ideas, then you can say that ideas don't drive the world, but it's very sort of useful for them to be on hand if they are needed. Yeah, and that means idea production very much in advance of the political opening for them. A society has to have a supply of ideas that go beyond its presently perceived needs and also its political possibilities. And when you have an opening, you better have a library full of good proposals.
Thank you. I'm Ben Soferstrand. I'm a professor of political science. I'll try to be really brief. One is, you sort of left the question of what comes after QE hanging in the air. One thing that I have been disappointed how underemphasized it has been is the distributional consequences of QE.
The what?
The distributional consequences
of
QE. You know, people who own capital get subsidies and the rest of us don't. Which makes me think about other tricks, so to speak. So first I'd like to ask you to sort of, is there still room in some way or another for Keynesian tricks, in the sense that you distribute consumer or you try to stimulate general aggregate demand by actually giving it to people who spend? Is there any way we can conceive of that at the European level of others? And my second question is, how do you see the future of the Southern Europe, given the European monetary union and the way the debt crisis has been handled? I think I'll just ask it in this open fashion because that's the shortest way to do it.
Yeah, and the short answer, I try to be short. As to Southern Europe in the monetary union, my view is that it cannot survive there much longer, and there's no in the present structure of the European monetary union, I don't think there's any way of rectifying this situation. In other words, we'll have to expect either a breaking up of the union, or, although that would demand perhaps too much of our politicians, especially of the German politicians, or a fundamental reform that allows for more monetary policy flexibility inside the Eurozone. Yes, we're killing Italy in this, and you see how the Italian political system has reacted to it. It's a complete disaster. And the next candidate will be France. If Macron is not re-elected, after him, après Macron, la déluge. Yeah, like in Italy. And something has to be done, and it cannot be done within the framework of the common currency. That's the answer to your second question. Give me one word on the first question. QE distribution. Yeah. Of course, we know this, and you asked the question if there is a return to a Keynesian capacity. For a Keynesian capacity, you need a political capacity to begin with. Now, in the 1930s, we have already discussed the question why capital is not pro-Keynesian, and the answer was that while under a Keynesian full employment economy, also capitalists would have some sort of profit, the situation would be such that workers would become too confident, so that at the end, the sort of cultural political hegemony of capital over labor would break apart. I think that argument still applies. And there is no political capacity that could and then of course in purely economic terms, now compare the states in the 1930s in terms of their already existing indebtedness to the states today. States today, even especially after 2008, are up to their ears in debt already. Yeah. So the question becomes, where should they take up debt? The only answer would be a monetary answer. You would simply have to continue to create money. But then you need channels where you get that money to people rather than to banks. And do you think that the banks would like that idea? The banks like more money if they can administer it. But if you sort of use the helicopter solution, and just sort of drop money on people, as Milton Friedman once suggested, that is not something that the economic and political orthodoxy will easily support. Yeah. And it has happened. So George Bush has. I remember the George Bush tax cut, where every American got, I think, $1,500, a check for $1,500 free. That's not enough. Yeah, that's not enough. And they may even use it to pay off their existing debt. Then nothing happens.
Well, we have run out of time, so I think that on that note, we'll have to say thank you to Professor Streeck and to everybody in the audience. And welcome back to our next seminar in the series, which will be announced on our website. So thank you.
Thanks.